EnvironmentSolutions.com.
21st Century Radio is sponsored by Hieronimus and Company. Now more of 21st Century Radio with your host, Dr. Zohara.
It's all about soul. It's all about faith and a deeper devotion. It's all about soul. 'Cause under love is a stronger emotion.
Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer and Nita Brockington, our engineer. Our guest this hour, Robert Kopecky, wrote his book, How to Get to Heaven Without Really Dying, Wisdom from a Near-Death Survivor, in an effort to help, quote, readers discover that heaven is not a destination, but an available state of being, as well as the physical potential of this beautiful planet, unquote, and I couldn't agree more. His book begins with a wonderful introduction that then describes Robert Kopecky's 3 near-death experiences. And as we will discuss this hour, he then has 3 different sections based on this motif of his 3 different experiences. And I take the time to share this in the introduction because we have covered so many books on the near-death experience for the last 35 years, and every once in a while something new comes along and you go, it's a goodie, it's a goodie. How to Get to Heaven by Robert Kopecky, because in it he really breaks it down for you into a spiritual perspective, his OBE, his presence, his life review, and purpose being forced back into life. So I ask you to share this hour with a near-death experiencer and author about what he learned about living that can add to our understanding about our purpose, our here-now opportunities, and perhaps what heaven is like as a reflection of what life on earth is intended to be. Welcome to 21st Century Radio, Robert.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zoe. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, wow. I've had a near-death, not 3. Like most people who have had a near-death, you've had 3. I mean, I have to repeat that. 3 near-death experiences. So why don't
Some people are just hard-headed.
I think you must have had a lot to learn in this capacity, and it's obviously so you can share it with others. So why don't we do the basics, the how, what, when, and how they were different and how they affected you, and then we'll get into some of the particulars.
Sure. Yeah. It usually is the most interesting part of it. You know, I've told the stories so many times now that sometimes I forget that everybody doesn't know them.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Because these really happened to me over the course of about 15 years or so, and the last one was almost 20 years ago now. So
wow.
When I recount these experiences, I do like to make it clear that I'm telling you the way that I remember them as best as I possibly can, like I remember them the day after they happened.
Right.
I try not to elaborate any over the years because I know that human memory is somewhat unreliable sometimes and can be kind of self-enhancing and stuff like that. So they're plenty miraculous, I think, as they are. The first one I had, I was in my mid-20s. And I was working in Los Angeles as an art director and illustrator, doing commercial art and animation design and stuff like that has been my career for my whole life, pretty much. And I was returning home from dropping my wife off at the airport through an unfamiliar neighborhood at dusk. And this will date me because I had a problem, a mechanical problem, with my cassette player in my car.
We love you for that alone.
Yeah. And it made that, if you can remember that sound that kind of struck terror in our hearts of the bloopy kind of tape being eaten by the machinery sort of thing. And I reached over and popped it out and pulled it out, and it had that long strand of tape stuck in the mechanism. And at the same time, I apparently glanced off kind of an oddly parked car and went straight into a telephone pole going about 35 miles an hour around there. And despite having a harness on, a seatbelt on, I broke the steering wheel with my face, unfortunately.
Wow. And
broke out the windshield with my head. And the next instant, I found myself essentially at the top of the telephone pole, looking down at the car crashed, with stuff running out of it and steam coming up. And I remember vividly looking to my left, and there was a moth flying around the street lamp that was right next to me. I could look over bushes and hedges into people's backyards in this kind of suburban area where I was, and I saw lights going on and heard people running out and saying, "Call an ambulance." And I was suspended, essentially bodiless. I mean, I didn't have any sense of, being in my body. I had a sense of being who I am. I saw it, as it were, through my eyes, but I felt like I had been sort of liberated, and like I was kind of enfolded in this intensely pleasant kind of field of loving intelligence, where I was. And these are things that all near-death experiencers feel, through
I did
different
also.
cultures.
Yes,
and
true.
This is the stuff that's all consistent, is this sense of being folded into love and this sense of transcendent unity. And I experienced those. And I did not feel alone. I felt as though someone were behind me, kind of guiding me, as it were. And I tried to communicate. I tried to sort of, levitate downwards, is the only way I can describe it. But nobody knew I was there. And then I was directed to leave, that it was time to go, and I was kind of shepherded away. I don't remember exactly what the transition was, but I ended up in this very beautiful kind of pastoral, illuminative, natural place with lots of green and lots of light, and speaking with a personage. I can't really put a face on it or describe whether it was actually a human figure. I only recall having had this kind of heart-to-heart with another person, so to speak, and hashing out some kind of important things, that I don't remember the exact details of, but, maybe it was kind of instructive in a way. And that's another thing that is consistent in my 3 near-death experiences and in all the ones I've heard of, is that there's usually some kind of karmic instruction, some kind of guidance as part of it. I woke up about 20 hours later in a hospital with a heavily bandaged head and a nurse present, and I went on back into my life, and at that time I didn't know of any near-death experiences. This was the mid-'80s, and now I know that Raymond Moody and Dr. Kenneth Ring and P.M.H. Atwater and those people had books out and stuff, but I didn't really know about them. And when I tried to tell people about my experience, they just looked at me funny. And so I kind of moved on into my life and got caught back up in things, although I did go back to the site and survey it on foot and confirm to myself only that the things that I had seen from up at the top of the telephone pole were essentially the same as I had seen them from the ground.
Okay, so your second, because I don't want to spend our whole night on the stories because your observations are so fascinating. The second near-death experience. So how many years later was that, and how old were you?
That was about 7 years later or so,
Wow.
and I was living a wild lifestyle. I'd been kind of sent off my tracks by the death of an aunt that was very close to me, amongst other things. And I suffered just kind of a physical breakdown. I mean, I suppose you could call it a drug overdose, because I was just being very self-destructive during those years. It's the one experience where I wasn't hospitalized, where there was no kind of documentation or anything like that. But my experience was that I passed out on the floor of my apartment, basically. I wasn't really out, but I was completely numb from the neck down.
Wow.
I was paralyzed from the neck down. And the room that I was in then filled in with a brilliant white cloud. And I once again had this sense of being physically liberated and this sense of being enfolded in this loving intelligence and not being alone again, as though someone were behind me, who then directed me to look into a certain area of the cloud, and it opened up into kind of a screen and started to play these scenes from my life that were not the greatest hits,
Fascinating.
so to speak, but these kind of pivotal or seminal moments when I had not been present with the kind of quality I should have been, when maybe I was hurting somebody, or I was missing an opportunity, or there was some life lesson that I was not conscious of happening. these were kind of like three-dimensional. They weren't like a screen so much as like boxes of time that I could kind of reach into or felt like I could participate in if I'd wanted to. And I just remember having had 5 or 6 of these, it seems. And then the woman that I was living with at the time was kind of hollering and screaming and stuff, and that started to penetrate my experience, and this cloud slowly, the screen kind of closed up and the cloud slowly evaporated, and I was back in reality again.
So the first one you described for us when you had your car crash. The second one, maybe a drug overdose or something. They're very different, obviously.
Very different, yeah.
And we'll talk about that. And then the third one.
The third one was some years later, was probably about the same 5, 6 years later or so. And at that time I was back on the beam, and I was doing pretty well and traveling between New York and Arizona, and I was in a small town in Arizona, kind of dressed like New York. I went to a Super Bowl Sunday thing to watch the game with some friends, and afterwards I was assaulted by this kind of skinhead.
Wow.
Is what we called him. This big kind of punk kid. While I was on a payphone, so that was a while ago too. And he started to assault me, and I kind of talked him out of it. And then he reached in and hung up the phone. I was talking to my fiancée at the time, and I stopped and settled him down, and he went away. And I got back on the phone, and he came back and started to become much more aggressive. And I made a terrible mistake that I'll always regret. I planted my rear foot, and I punched him right on the chin as he was assaulting me, and knocked him out flat, basically. And the people around me all kind of applauded like they thought I'd done something good. And I wasn't sure, so I made good my escape. I headed home. And I didn't realize that there had been a van full of these guys, these skinheads, this kind of a gang that had watched the whole thing. And they drove up behind me and hit me in the back of the head with something like a crowbar or a tire iron and knocked me unconscious. And then they stomped and kicked me, I guess, for the better part of an hour, the worst part of an hour.
Wow.
And in this one, I did not go someplace that was celestial at all. It had rather a terrestrial feeling. It was kind of womb-like, which may be very appropriate. And I was surrounded by entities, by spiritual entities, who were all telling me that I had to go back despite not wanting to. And I was protesting. I wanted to stay. I'd had enough. I didn't want to have to go back. There was a sense of terrible things happening kind of outside of the experience. But my memory is that they essentially picked me up. I felt a bunch of hands on me and kind of pushed me through a membrane that I sort of popped back through, and I opened my eyes laying on my back on this street in this Arizona town, and an emergency medical worker over me said, "He's back." And so that was the third one. And the fact that all three were so different, once these experiences kind of crystallized within me some years later, I became very curious as to why. The first one is, as you mentioned before, is that I learned the gift of perspective, I call it.
Yeah.
And the second one, the gift of presence, by the moments I was shown. And the third one then, the gift of purpose, by being sort of forced back to do what I was meant to do.
So fascinating. I mean, such an unusual real story, such an unusual set of circumstances to pull these all together. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, then we'll start talking about how, when somebody has one experience, that's one thing. And then they have two, and then you had three. Obviously, there is, even when we're unconscious of how these things are all related, they obviously all have great purpose in your life, Robert, or, we have to assume that everything that happens, I used to like the way Deepak Chopra would say it, whether I was calling him on the telephone or walking down the street, he'd say, the whole universe is conspiring with you for this moment. We'll be right back. Robert Kopecky is our guest. His beautiful book, it's really terrific, How to Get to Heaven Without Really Dying. Wisdom from a Near-Death Survivor, a Llewellyn publication 2018 release. Learn more at his website, www.robertkopecky, KOPECKY.com.
Hello, this is Dr. PMH Atwater. I'm one of the original researchers in the field of near-death studies. Done a lot with generations, the new children, evolution, my newest book, Children of the Fifth World. And I've had the privilege and the great fun of being on 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. And you know, she is just such a great interviewer. I absolutely love being on her show. She's smart. She's right there. She's quick. Who could ask for a better interviewer? You are lucky to just be listening. Have fun with this great lady.
How sweet. I've never heard that. Thank you, PMH. PMH Atwater, again, she has done wonderful books. In fact, I contributed to her one that has not yet come out, or it's about to, on children and their near-death experience, where actually, as our guest, Robert Kopecky, might be interested, I shared my near-death experience when I almost drowned by willful, belligerent disobedience of the rules. That sort of set my whole life on course. Seems to be what I do best, is disobey. Anyway, yeah. So Robert, you shared with us a remarkable sequence of 3 near-death experiences that each brought you something so different. But as you point out, you believe your experiences are really to help you experience the divine in the present, and to help others know that death should not be scary. That on the other side, we're not alone. Everybody says that. Every tradition speaks to that truth. But let's go back to your first experience and then your second, because those were about 5 years apart and you were still in your 20s. How did that affect you, just as a person, and the kinds of thoughts you had about what you went through that at that point might not have been popular knowledge?
Yeah, and I can kind of address all 3 of them in this regard and give you just a little breakdown of what the differences were. And the first one, I just didn't know what to do with it at all.
Okay.
I wasn't aware of any kind of community of near-death experiencers whatsoever. And like I said, when I tried to talk to people about it, they were not interested. They looked at me funnier than usual.
Mm-hmm.
They were not really interested. The second one, and by the way, I didn't think that these events had big effects in my life at the time. I didn't realize why I made these huge changes shortly after. I left relationships and moved from city to city and stuff like that. But it never seemed to me like it had anything to do with
fascinating. So you didn't draw a line between the big rock that got dropped in your pond and what happened from afterwards.
I think that I had always felt a little bit different all along. Of course, we never know exactly how we measure up in that regard, because we're never anybody else until we experience the kind of elimination of separateness and start to realize we're all kind of the same person,
Right.
But the second one did the same sort of thing to me. I made these big changes in my life, but it still didn't really register. And the third one, it really did have a big effect on me. But it wasn't until kind of around 9/11, because I was present at 9/11, and when that happened, I had this kind of sensory experience of this sort of swirl of liberated spirits, is what it seemed to me, like an extrasensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, my life really started to change dramatically.
When you say you were present at 9/11, you were at the Trade Towers? Or
no,
you went down there
afterwards?
I was
in lower Midtown, and I walked down almost immediately afterwards. I walked downtown to where I lived through the smoke clouds and stuff like that. And walking through that street with all the streets in Manhattan closed off and stuff, walking through the streets with all the smoke and stuff, and seeing the people walk by me covered with the effluence, the dust and stuff from the... and I just had this experience of kind of a grand spiritual scale that helps to direct me to actually leaving town, I got a little cabin up on the upper Delaware River, and I developed a pretty powerful meditation practice. And everything kind of changed for me then. I became a vegetarian, and I started studying ancient texts and reading books just one after another. And it wasn't until a couple of years into my meditation that the three experiences really crystallized within me. And I think it's because I kind of got to a place in my meditation, this place where I kind of experienced a sense of pure love and the kind of radiant illumination and transcendent unity that are all part of every near-death experience that you hear.
Yes.
And when I had that experience, kind of, it's almost as though the three NDEs flooded into me and filled out this whole kind of meaning, this profound meaning to me of the perspective I'd gotten from my out-of-body experience, where it's just hard to get the genie back into the bottle once you've seen things that way, and the idea that it can really help us to survive this life by having that kind of perspective, and the presence that I got from having those eternal moments shown to me again in that life review, and then the sense of purpose that I had from that point on in my life that I had kind of been forced back into this life to assume, like as we all do.
Yeah, to be of service. It's an interesting thing how humans learn to be of service, and at what point in their incarnation they realize that that is the purpose of an incarnation. I mean, there's lots of growing and learning and experiencing and having relationships, but our purpose is to be of service. I mean, that's what I believe. Somebody asked me to go to this big drawn-out, master's program with all these PhDs and heads of universities, and I said, well, what are they going to talk about? And they said, well, we're going to do a retreat on what it means to be a human. And I said, well, how about if I just give it to you over the phone? And that's when I said, from my vantage point, from my life experience, I believe it's to be of service. I want to talk about some of the biggies that you write about in your book, because I think it's really essential to the gift you offer others, is that a near-death experience really does teach us about living with divine consciousness in the present. And I know PMH and others who have worked with children in near-death, Morse, Moody, etc., and my own experience of it is that you do come back with a different kind of awareness about your purpose. And that you are here for a reason. And PM has found that children, who have near-death experiences are different than their peers. They tend to eat better. They take care of nature. They take care of animals. They're much more compassionate. All things that I can say I experienced, whether that came from that near-death, I don't know. But I thought you spoke of certain things that, to me, are the cornerstone of right living. You used words, and I'd like to just share the list, and then we'll go through them. Kindness, humility, honesty, forgiveness, compassion, and service. And that this presence, which we talked about a little earlier with another guest, Stephen Jenkinson, who's written a book called Come of Age, about being present, that's our biggest gift and our biggest challenge. So why don't we talk about some of these qualities that you experienced from your near-death experience that is about how we live in the world, being able to reflect divinity.
Yeah, well, the perspective that I talk about from the out-of-body experience, when you're actually above the physicality of your reality, what you've always considered to be real, and you're watching it from a bird's eye view, and you see your body and you see other people, then you realize, as I did throughout all three of them, that consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is an existent field that we are all channeling, we're all filtering all the time. And everything that we see is really an expression of consciousness. And when I can witness somebody with their expressions pouring out of them, sometimes maybe they seem like an antagonist, for example, I can recognize that they're not actually an antagonist towards me, that I just happen to be there and to have the honor, the pleasure of witnessing divine consciousness pouring through the filter of who they are, of their life's experiences, of their DNA, of their traumas and victories and all of that. And so with that perspective, I can compassionately detach and witness the miracle of divine consciousness as it expresses itself through this person, and as it's doing it through me and through everybody that I meet then. And that, and being able to have that perspective on life just makes it a lot easier, and kind of gives you the sense of being a conductor of an orchestra a little bit, more than having life happening to you, life is happening for you.
And I liked the reason I said those words: kindness, humility, honesty, forgiveness, compassion, and service. You found that all of these qualities, these attributes of being, are the ones that bring us this sense of open awe, wonder, I think would be the way I think of it.
A little piece of heaven.
Amen. I used to joke I'm a cheerleader for paradise. Well, I think like you probably, and other near-death experiencers and others who are meditators, I really do believe that the perfection we dream of is the stamp on our DNA, kind of like we all come in with the same perfection remembered. And then we get down here and we go, well, how are we going to do that?
Right,
how are we going to make this look like that, when that is what we are to do? As above, so below, as within, so without. And your NDEs seem to have confirmed that for you, this great Hermetic teaching.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually that's from the Gospel of Thomas, I draw the sort of inspiration for this book, which is the kingdom of heaven is spread across the earth, but men don't have eyes to see it. Mm-hmm. Which may be gender specific. Mm-hmm. It's possible, but kindness, honesty, humility, forgiveness, compassion, service, everybody has had a little piece. Everybody has experienced a little piece of heaven at some point in their life, when everything just comes together and just feels so good, and you have that sense of pure love and transcendent unity, and it's the kind of illuminative aspect of the moment shining out of a child's face or glistening off of a lake or something like that, And those feelings that you have are the feelings of heaven, as I put, which is a state of being, not an actual locality. Although it may very well be a locality. I'm not any kind of expert on the afterlife, really. My experiences were limited to what I apparently needed, because they're very custom made. But if you want to experience that kind of those heavenly sensations and that state of being, then you have to align yourself with how, people are in heaven, right? And they're all very nice and honest and humble and forgiving and compassionate. And, every angel
those are the good ones.
Yeah.
I don't think that everybody is
put down their harp to help.
Yeah, I'm not saying, I don't think that everybody is equally evolved. It's like, those who work in ancestral work, they say not all of your ancestors are healthy and whole. Just
right,
because, we still go to school on the other side, and we still grow and make choices, but it's not an easy thing to bear a body.
Well, I'm talking about creating karma, right? Taking the actions that will align you with that. I mean, if you exhibit as much kindness as you can, and if you're rigorously honest and you're grounded in humility, where you're just being your authentic self, you're not competing, you're not manipulating, you forgive other people because you recognize we're all in it together, and the same thing for compassion, and then you're willing to be of service to anybody unconditionally, you are basically projecting the vibrations of heaven into your life, right? And creating this kind of heavenly bubble where other people start to enter it and interface with it, and that brings that out in them, and they may have that going already. There's plenty of, when you're a really nice person, if you're being as nice as you can be, you discover there's all kinds of nice people out there. And you start to generate heaven. Kind of the point of those principles. That's how everybody is in heaven, and it's an ideal. There may be ancestors somewhere up there or out there or wherever they are exactly. I don't know. It's extra dimensional. I don't know exactly where it is.
Yeah, exactly.
No, and they're working through their custom-made afterlives too, so to speak.
Well, of course, and we all are. But what I like about the way you share your experience is that it's not about having a near-death experience. It's about having an experience that makes our living deeper and broader and more full.
Yeah, now I had, in each of my experiences, they weren't prolonged illnesses or something, so I didn't lay around anticipating it, which is a big part of the death experience. I kind of talk about that in my first book, How to Survive Life and Death, about ameliorating those kinds of fears and stuff. But the sense of one's being alive all the time, you know, it was like stepping into another room for me. You know, I got hit or I got smashed or, you know, I passed out, and suddenly I was still alive, but in a completely different way. So we're always alive.
Exactly.
Point.
No, and I think you said it so well.
The same things are always working in our life.
Well, as I had a teacher years ago who said, if you want to understand something in the spiritual world, look at what it is in the physical world. So if you want to know how you feed somebody or how somebody is fed spiritual wisdom, look at how you prepare food, how you set your table. I mean, it might sound strange, but it turned out to be really great wisdom.
Yeah, and I think that if you even take that a step further, which is something that I really try to maintain in my life, but it's really hard to do, is that we have this sense of ourselves as being physical, material beings who occasionally get a grasp on something spiritual. We have a spiritual moment or a spiritual experience, and we try to hold on to it. Turn that equation completely around and experience this life as a spiritual being, that then these ever-changing material forms are arising out of this loving matrix of intelligence, right? Of potential. And it requires a kind of a diligence with it, but that's when you're really kind of occupying heaven. And every moment has this joyful potential in it and the miraculousness of all life, whether it's this life or the next life or, you know, the many lives we live within this life. You know, it's always is the opportunity to experience that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that whole a way of seeing ourselves as spiritual beings having a material experience.
Right.
And that all of our experiences, encounters with individuals, with ourselves, with the environment, in our work, in our family, I really do believe we call all things into our life that we need. And we need the experiences for our growth. And I've never believed in the victimhood status that things happen to us out of nowhere, that it's just some sort of randomness. I don't believe there's randomness in the universe. It's not been my experience anyway. Robert Kopecky is our guest. How to Get to Heaven Without Really Dying. Wisdom from a Near-Death Survivor, a Llewellyn publication. They've been kind enough to give us a book to give away, so listen to his name carefully, Robert Kopecky. And you can learn more online at www.robertkopecky, KOPECKY.com.
Hello, I'm Dr. Diane Corcoran. I am the President Emeritus of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I would like to invite any veterans who think they might have had a near-death experience to contact us at our website at ians.org, and I am happy to answer any emails or information that people might need to help clarify what the NDE is for them. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. First caller at 410-922-6680. That's 410-WCBM-680 or 1-800-922-6680. If you know the name of our guest, you'll win a copy of his book, courtesy of Llewellyn Publications, How to Get to Heaven Without Really Dying, Wisdom from a Near-Death Survivor. So, Robert, I want to come back to, we haven't really talked about all the wonderful exercises you have in your book. Is there any particular one you'd like to share?
Well, I think the one that I like that seems to be sort of the the easiest for people and probably the most fun is to just give kindness a try for a day or two. And by that I mean, even if you're already a nice person, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are already, very nice people, but when you go through your day, just consciously be aware of being authentically kind to people. So not being sarcastic or sharing gossip, nothing like that, but just really being open-heartedly kind to whoever you're dealing with, and watch what happens. It has a transformative effect and kind of an alchemical kind of effect, right? It can change the most lead-like day to gold, so to speak. And it's these kinds of transformative experiences that I'm trying to inspire people to try through the practice of the principles that I have in the perspective in the first part of the book, and then of entering into presence, too. I talk about a number of ancient texts that have these things that are totally valid in our life right now, like kindness, like honesty and humility and forgiveness, compassion and service. But I think that the kindness, I like to present it as a challenge, a kindness challenge. You give it a try tomorrow all day as best as you possibly can and watch what happens.
Some of the wonderful things you share in your book also includes respect, and I'm grateful you mentioned it, animals and nature. That often we think that the human is somehow or other the most evolved, and I've always said, well, we have a particular purpose, and so do animals, and so does nature, and we're all collaborators, and we have different cultures and different languages, but we're all sentient. We just have a different way of using consciousness. So talk to us a bit about that for yourself, because I agree with you, and as would I'd say all our guests for the most part, that consciousness is, whether we have a body or not, we continue, and like it or not. And the other thing I always joke about, Robert, is we're all in this together, or we're all in this together. That's great.
We are all the same thing. If you hold the Earth at arm's length, it is just one little ball that has, kind of a 5 o'clock shadow on it that is all of humanity, basically, and all of the life on the planet. So it's very true. Animals, I think they directly live their being, their authentic being. They are directly connected into divine consciousness, and so their expression is without the kinds of complications that as human beings we have. That's what makes being in human form, so challenging and so difficult, is that we have this ego telling us we're more important than everything else. You could say that we're more like God, so we can make things, we can force our will on things. And look where that's getting us. If you're being really spiritually sane about what you see in the world and what you feel in your life, you know that there are certain things, certain practices you really can't continue and still feel right about. For me, that has to do with the way that we treat animals and the fact that we're losing so many species at such a rate. That's not being spiritually responsible. And what we have as humans is the ability to change things, to have this kind of effect on the rest of the world. And we need to kind of wake up to that so that we can recognize that we may not really be the superior creature on the planet, that it may be more of a horizontal hierarchy of just different forms that are, channeling divine consciousness, and that there's a lot we can learn from animals.
No question about it. I mean, yeah. I feel absolutely that way, and have seen, whether you listen to a tree or you listen to a bird, there is story, and they are communicating, and if we could get quiet enough, we could come into telepathic rapport with everything. And of course, that is, the Aborigines, from the time they're born till they die, most of their communication is done without speech. It's
the indigenous cultures. I mean, we're extra-dimensional creatures ourselves, as I believe that all animals are, and all life really on Earth is expressing this divine consciousness that's imbued with, this matrix of loving intelligence, so to speak. And I always like to say that we have a misperception problem as people. We're just not. we just tend to get caught up so much in the way we think that we miss an awful lot. And if you try to investigate alternative modes of living that include meditation and eating right and experiencing nature in an open-hearted way, then you start to tune in on that sixth sense that we all have.
When you look at other near-death experiencers and their stories and your story, how did your story affect the people around you?
Well, they didn't so much because of the nature of my sharing it. I didn't really share any of it until some years afterwards, as I described. It didn't come out in my life in a public way at all. I was having all of these experiences inwardly, but I kept clinging on to the kind of the forms of my life, who I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to be doing.
Right, the concept of it all.
Think of me. And it wasn't until all of that stuff fell apart and I had this kind of dark night of the soul or this transformative experience where, in a sense, I died to my ego self, so to speak. And then I'm kind of lying because everybody knows you do need to die to go to heaven. I'm just talking about not actually dying physically.
Right, not having to leave your body entirely and assessing life, right.
But dying from this sense of who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to have and all of that kind of stuff that really isn't true when push comes to shove. Death is the great equalizer for all of us. And if you don't have sufficient humility to recognize that we're not separate with this world, when you're on your deathbed, you will find it. Yeah, right. You will become humble. That's what I believe death is about. Because if we're eternal beings, why do we have to die? Well, I think it's so that we can experience that absolute humility that's essential for our growth.
As I shared with our earlier guest, Stephen Jenkinson, who's written this book, Come of Age, The Case for Elderhood in the Time of Trouble, and I was recounting how I worked for a number of years writing about the Kabbalistic tree of life, and through it did work with the prophets, the female and the male prophets of ancient Hebrew tradition. And in doing that research, I discovered that Maimonides, in addition to the 13 forms of prophecy that a prophet experiences, were the qualifications of what makes a prophet. And of course, we're all meant to be prophets. A prophet is someone who speaks for and with Creator. So we're all meant to be prophets. That's our purpose. And he said it's courage, humility, and imagination. The courage to stand alone and say what you see and to do it as an individual. The humility, because if you're not humble, universe doesn't come to you in a form of asking to serve in that way. And then imagination, the ability to hold the images, to hold the impressions. And then again, the courage to share it, the humility to be worthy of it, to be the vessel for it, because it's not yours. It's yours to share. It's your obligation. And then there's this whole thing about, do you share it with one person? Do you share it with your community? Is it meant for you alone? And sometimes near-death experiences are that way as well. Sometimes they are for the person alone, and sometimes it's for the person in their community, or in your case, the person and the world. So how has this affected your life in the sense of when people come to you and they're afraid to talk about their concerns about death, or their concerns about their consciousness, or their concerns about who they are and what they're doing? What are some of the most general kinds of things that you address for the community?
Well, that's something that I talk about in the second part of the book of Presence that I learned from that life review, where I was shown those moments. I was shown these moments that were like boxes of time where I really could have done something different. I could have made a difference, and I didn't. And that was the sense that I got from those experiences. So now as I'm going through life, of course, I am consciously trying to be aware in every moment. And I call them eternal moments, right, because we're always here now. And so whenever I'm dealing with somebody, I'm witnessing them as this vessel of divine consciousness, this kind of filter that's coming through this package of information, this kind of karmic quantum data, that a person is. And I try to be as very present as I absolutely can be, because in this present moment is when you can reach into this box of time and move things around, make a difference, to be able to contribute to something, to be able to be of service, which is you getting out of your own way, right? I mean, that's the whole deal about that kind of humility, is that you become teachable when you're your authentic self. Mm-hmm. And you can also then become a clear witness to others. When you're at that level of authenticity, then you get that from the other person, and you start to kind of merge. You start to have this, what Joseph Campbell used to say, that we're all here to realize the metaphysical impulse to transcend the delusion of separateness.
But beautifully said. I mean, when you first hear it, it does make you laugh. But then when you reflect on it, that is really true.
Yeah, and he always had a big smile on his face when he was saying that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It was so perfect.
But
material life, in a way, is kind of a metaphor for our spiritual life, I think. The world is reflecting to us what we are bringing to it as this package of karmic information we are. And so we get the chance to observe that miracle in everybody and everything, and to take part with that equation turned around as a spiritual being, then for whom this ever-changing world of matter is forming, out of this wonderful field of vast potential that we call consciousness.
Amen. So may we elevate ourselves and those we come in contact with, and those we think about, and those we pray for. And, there are so many opportunities for all of us to make a difference in the world. And as I like to share with those who say, well, I don't have a position, I'm not important, I don't have money, I said, no, every little thought we have really makes a difference in the world. Would you like to close with a going away thought? We have about 10 seconds.
Yeah, I used to think that my life was like a blockbuster, like a James Bond movie, but then I discovered it's really more like a low-budget indie. And that's okay.
They have great music. To wonderful music in your life, Robert Kopecky, thank you for your wonderful work and your effort to be of service. How to get to heaven without really dying, go to www.robertkopecky.com.
We can all live.
Stay connected and stay informed on the #1 news talk station, Talk Radio 680, WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.